Welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending this session, and I hope more people will join us later. I'm Nayereh Tohidi, and it's a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce to you our keynote speaker, who is one of the most prominent feminists in the international law, field of international law, especially given her background as someone originally from Algeria with direct experience with fundamentalism. That many of us have some taste of it, right? She has such an impressive bio that I hate to cut it short. So I'm going to quickly read it so that you can see what kind of background she's coming from. Dr. Karima Bennoune is the Louis Symes Professor of Law at the University of Michigan. She specializes in public international law and international human rights law, including issues related to culture, extremism, and terrorism, and women's human rights. Professor Bennoune served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights from 2015 to 2021. She also was appointed as an expert for the International Criminal Court, ICCI, in 2017 during the reparation phase of the groundbreaking case, the prosecutor versus Ahmad Ali Faqih al-Mahdi, which concerned international destruction of cultural heritage sites in Mali. In September 2023, she addressed the United Nations Security Council about gender apartheid in Afghanistan. In December 2023, she traveled to South Africa with Nobel laureate Malala Yousafzai to participate with her and Nelson Mandela's widow, the prominent human rights advocate, Gersha Mesha. In a panel following Malala's Nelson Mandela annual lecture. The Women in International Law interest group of the American Society of International Law presented her with its 2024 Prominent Woman in International Law Award. Since 2018, she has been a member of the board of editors of the American Journal of International Law. Dr. Bennoune is a former legal advisor for Amnesty International. She has carried out human rights missions in most regions of the world. From 2012 to 2022, Bennoune served on the faculty of the University of California, Davis, at the School of Law, becoming the Homer Angelo and Anne Beryl Hill Endowed Chair in International Law and Martin Luther King Jr., where she was Professor of Law and the Arthur Dickinson's Scholar. She received the Chancellor's Distinguished Research Award at Dixon as Dixon Scholar. When Professor Bennoune first taught at the University of Michigan at the law school in 2001, she won the Hartright Award for Excellence in Teaching. Her book, Your Fatwa Doesn't Apply Here, received the 2014 Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Released by W.W. Norton and Company in August 2013 was the time that the book was published in paperback and then later in first in hard copy and then in paperback. She also gave a TED Talk based on the book, the same book that I mentioned, and millions of people, actually up to recent time, 1.5 million people have watched that TED Talk that she offered. Perhaps more by now. Dr. Bennoune's academic publications have appeared in many leading journals, including the American Journal of International Law, the Berkeley Journal of International Law, the Columbia Human Rights Law Review, the Columbia Journal of Transnational Law, and the European Journal of International Law. Her topical writing has been published by the New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, the Huffington Post, Open Democracy, Reuters, and the Washington Post. Making frequent media appearances, Dr. Bennoune has spoken on CNN, Anderson Cooper's program, CNN International, MSNBC, all with Chris Hayes at Fox News. So you appear at Fox too sometimes. It's useful, actually. They need to hear you. And the National Public Radio, Australian Broadcasting Service, BBC Radio, Radio France International, and McNeil Report of NewsHour on PBS. In 2007, Dr. Bennoune became the first Arab American to win the Derek Bell Award from the Association of American Law Schools section on minority groups. She received the 2016 Rights and Leadership Award from the International Action Network for Gender Equity and Law. In 2017, she was named one of the Law Dragon 500 leading lawyers in America. She has been a member of the Executive Council of the American Society of International Law. Currently, she sits on the Scholar Advisory Board of Muslims for Progressive Values. And again, it's our pleasure and honor that you have accepted our invitation, and here we are all ears to hear you.
Thank you very much for that very kind and very long introduction, and it sort of makes me tired listening to it. But I'm really very honored to be here speaking at this important conference, and I want to thank Iran Academia for inviting me. I think their work is so important, and I have to say I've been turning down invitations lately, but this one was very important to me because I think it is crucial to be speaking and working with scholars who are specialists on Iran, as it seems like a really critical moment to keep principled international attention on the human rights crisis in the country. I think the question is, how does one talk about this in this current, difficult, fractured global moment? We face a very difficult environment in which to talk about human rights in Iran. On the one hand, there are governments and other voices that are trying to exploit criticism of Iran's terrible human rights record, but for their own political reasons in the current environment. And one example of this, of course, was the recent speech by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to the U.S. Congress, in which he tried to use the terrible human rights record of the Iranian government as a way of basically smearing anyone in the United States who has protested against the war in Gaza. And of course, he did this by trying to link them all to the Iranian regime. And one of the terrible ironies is, as you see in the picture in the bottom, some of the people who were protesting during his speech were actually families of Israeli hostages themselves who wanted a deal and who opposed the war. So we have this kind of exploitation of the situation in Iran on the one side. On the other side, we find those who refuse to criticize the Iranian government at all or who downplay its abuses. And a very infamous example of this was the now former South African foreign minister back in April when she was still in post, saying at a Carnegie Endowment for International Peace event that she did not know whether or not the Iranian government was an authoritarian regime. And I should say, unfortunately, as some of you know very well, there are also some academics who take a similar stance. And I was very sorry yesterday in the discussion on feminism to hear one Iranian scholar explain that in a particular European country, in the context of the war in Gaza, Iranian academics are being told that they cannot criticize their government because that government is allegedly supporting Palestine. So you see this sort of terrible trap on all sides. In my view as a human rights lawyer, all these approaches, from instrumentalization to denial, are unacceptable. They all make it easier for the Iranian authorities to escape accountability, and none of them will do anything to actually improve the human rights situation lived by Iranians. So the question is it possible to navigate between these poles and define a different international discourse that could actually be constructive? So to try to answer this question in the time that I have and leaving time for discussion, I'm going to briefly reflect on recent developments in Iran from a human rights perspective, and then address issues related to ensuring that academia internationally responds in a principled way. And I'm going to do that drawing from my own work in the field of international human rights law. So I begin then with the recent human rights situation in Iran, though I do this knowing there are many experts on this in the room. For me, I would say personally, as a human rights lawyer, I was inspired by the courage and the creativity of the Women Life Freedom protest movement sparked by the killing of Gina Mahsa Amini. For me, this really was a truly 21st century freedom struggle, and nothing less than what I've called a hope-kindling Farsi translation and live enactment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one of our central human rights documents, which recognizes that we are all born free and equal, and which reaffirms the rights of women. And the protesters were really enacting that live on the streets of Iran. Now, unfortunately, as we know, all of this very creative resistance has been dangerous for those who take part in it. I have to say now I am gravely concerned about how much worse the human rights violations may become, given the short global attention span and the growing regional tensions. The current situation is already very grave. Just to remind ourselves of the statistics, according to the Boromon Center for Human Rights in Iran, between September 2022 and August 2024, they documented 1,411 cases of executions that have been announced to be carried out. That includes 9 juveniles, 319 sentences of flogging, 538 arbitrary killings in protests, which includes 57 juveniles, and 13 deaths in custody. And the center stresses, of course, this is just what they have been able to document. The numbers, the real numbers, may in fact be higher. So I think it's no wonder, given these statistics, that the UN's independent international fact-finding mission on Iran, in its first report to the UN Human Rights Council in March, used very strong language and said that violent repression of peaceful protests and pervasive institutional discrimination against women has led to serious human rights violations by the government of Iran, many amounting to crimes against humanity. Now, let me stress, as an international lawyer, crimes against humanity are some of the most serious international crimes prohibited by international law. They are widespread or systematic attacks against a civilian population with knowledge of the attack. In other words, this represents a very grave situation to which the international community and academics globally must respond effectively. It is vital for scholars to find ways to shed light on the ongoing human rights crisis and to spark renewed international interest through thoughtful analysis and engagement. It is also critical to underscore, as this quote on the screen does, that this latest wave of repression of protesters, as you all know so well, did not come out of nowhere. And I knew this to be true from my own past work as the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, when I was faced with many cases of imprisoned Iranian writers and artists, including some who tragically died in jail. I also had to respond to many cases of Iranian women, writers and singers who had been arrested, women who were being denied access to public spaces like stadiums, and who faced severe dress restrictions. Most recently, the UN's Fact-Finding Commission, again, made this link between the current abuses and this past history, and they argue that pervasive and deep-rooted structural and institutionalized discrimination against women, it was both a trigger and an enabler of widespread serious human rights violations and crimes. So I think very important to make that connection. One thing that I would add to their description of the underlying situation is the practice of gender apartheid by the regime. And here I'm really echoing the phrase used by the former UN Special Rapporteur on Iran, Javed Rahman, as well as other UN human rights experts, in particular to describe the hijab law that was passed by Parliament in 2023. And in their joint statement, they made clear that this law could be considered a form of gender apartheid because authorities appear to be governing through systematic discrimination with the intention of suppressing women and girls into total submission. This, I think, is an important and visionary statement deserving of support and an accurate description. I note that the use of the term gender apartheid is somewhat controversial in the Iranian context, which is distinct from the Afghan context to which this concept applies most easily. But I also stress that numerous Iranian human rights defenders, including both Iranian Nobel Peace Prize laureates, have used this term to describe the system they battle. And there is indeed today a global campaign led by Afghans and Iranians to recognize in law this concept of gender apartheid. I don't have more time to talk about this concept now, but what I think is important about it is the way that it really surfaces the systematic and ideological nature of the repression of women. And I'm very happy to talk about this more in the discussion later, and if anyone would like to have a detailed discussion about the gender apartheid campaign, please wait and see me after this session. I should stress that this is a concept that was invented by women human rights defenders from Muslim-majority contexts themselves, from Iran all the way over to North Africa, back in the late 80s and 90s, as a way of describing and resisting fundamentalist politics. So, in the face of this dire human rights situation, so bad that two separate UN human rights mechanisms have been created to respond to it, what might academics do? Well, I think there are many important projects which can and should be undertaken. Some already are. These include many things that Iran Academia is doing: documentation, translation, analysis, amplifying the frontline voices so that we hear them all around the world, and supporting and engaging with Iranian human rights defenders. And I think for one important example of the work of these defenders, of the Abdurrahman Boraman Center for Human Rights in Iran, whose statistics I already cited. It was, as many of you know, started by historian sisters Roya and Ladan Boramand to honor their father, who was an Iranian democracy advocate and was assassinated by agents of the Iranian state in exile in 1991. And so the sisters created what they termed a victim-centered research and education group to document human rights abuses in Iran to honor his memory. And many of you are likely familiar with their work, but if not, you can find them at iranrights.org. And one of the most moving pieces of their work is this database, OMID, which is really the centerpiece of their work, and it is an internet database of the victims of the Islamic Republic killed with or without a death sentence, including, tragically, this Baha'i woman whose case you see here on screen. Organizations like the Boraman Center and many others that I could mention, including Justice for Iran and the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center, need more academic engagement and support internationally. But I would say this to my fellow academics. More than anything, they need us not to undermine their difficult work, which I regret is sometimes done in certain fields, including Middle Eastern studies and women's studies and others, in particular in some versions of critical theory, decolonial, and post-colonial theory. In this regard, in my work, I have made a particular plea to those in the Western Academy to proceed with caution, to avoid undercutting dissident feminist and human rights voices in the name of fashionable academic theories that verge on cultural relativism and what Arab scholar Elham Mania has called the essentialist paradigm. As a person of Muslim heritage myself, who has worked for many years trying to support movements challenging fundamentalists from North Africa to South Asia and beyond, I have witnessed repeated failures by academia and some parts of the political spectrum globally, and many of my fellow academics, to understand these human rights struggles. I call these failures theoretical denial, and for me they represent the minimization of women's everyday struggles. While the right in the West on the political spectrum has sometimes demonized all Muslims as fundamentalists, which is, of course, also completely unacceptable, the left has sometimes minimized the threat that Muslim fundamentalist governments and movements, like those in Iran, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, and others, the threat they pose to human rights in Muslim-majority countries. And I was very sorry, again, to hear yesterday in one panel about this happening to Iranians now. And I realize in some way, my speech really is, I think, collectively, perhaps for many of us, not directed at this audience, but at broader academia, and thinking about how we might work together to challenge some of these ideas. And I simply wanted to say to those who are experiencing this now, you are not alone. Many of us have faced these problems in academia for many years. And so I hope that we can work together to show that another, more principled and nuanced human rights discourse is possible. Perhaps one of the many lessons academics must learn from Iranian women activists today is how much is at stake in human rights terms in how we frame and respond to existential struggles like theirs. We must listen to diverse Iranian women activists and human rights defenders on the ground and in exile, and reshape our paradigms to include and reflect on their analysis, to amplify their voices and concerns, rather than imposing our simple theoretical paradigms on their complex realities without attention to context. They have the equal right to be critical of their own context. They deserve to be heard. As Roya Boramand explained to me, their fight is existential, and not paying attention to them has made their work more difficult. This brings me to the thematic portion of my remarks. So, drawing from my own academic work, I want to consider how we in international academia should ethically position ourselves in relation to women's human rights struggles globally, in particular to struggles against fundamentalist oppression like the one in Iran. I teach international law and human rights, and my most recent writing has been in a genre called feminist international law, a school of thought which really dates from the 1990s. So please allow me just to pivot for a moment to briefly introduce this field and contemplate what it can tell us today about scholarly stances in the wake of women, life, freedom. So women legal scholars and advocates like those you see on screen in the early 1990s made tremendous revolutionary achievements in the field of international law that laid the foundations for a feminist approach to that discipline. These feminist international lawyers came from all regions of the world. And a great deal of progress was made in the field and using international law as a result. But unfortunately, discrimination against women remains one of the most pervasive human rights violations around the world. As a 2017 statement by UN human rights experts asserted, women's rights are facing an alarming backlash in many parts of the world. This is part of a global problem. We need more than ever to protect, they said, the fundamental principle that all rights are universal. And I was asked recently to contribute to a retrospective survey of progress made since the beginning of feminist international law. And so I wrote this piece called Multidirectionality and Universality about global feminisms and international law in the 21st century. And I'm so grateful to the conference organizers for having it translated into Farsi, so it is also available in both languages. Perhaps you may find that some of the issues in the article are also relevant to those working in Iranian studies today as well. And I argued in the piece that advancing the goals of feminist international law today requires us to renew our commitment to the universality of human rights and requires us to use what I call multidirectionality, and I will explain that in a moment. And really, to try to explain this concept of multidirectionality, in the article, I talk about a demonstration, a very iconic demonstration organized in 1989 in London by British South Asian women, so British women of Pakistani, Indian, Bangladeshi descent, and so on, in support of the writer Salman Rushdie, who had then been condemned to death, as we know, by a fatwa from the Ayatollah Khomeini. That very brave protest provides a helpful metaphor by what I mean by multidirectionality. And unfortunately, it's an example that has again become very topical given recent events in the UK in the last few weeks. So back in that 1989 demonstration, these campaigners from the anti-racist feminist group Southall Black Sisters and Women Against Fundamentalism led this protest trying to support Salman Rushdie, carrying signs that said things like, "Religious leaders don't speak for us." But they found themselves in a terrible position. The women stood literally at that demonstration near the British Parliament between two groups of men. On the one side, there was a phalanx of British Muslim fundamentalist demonstrators denouncing Rushdie and calling for blasphemy laws, and even in some cases for violence against Mr. Rushdie. But that was not it. On the other side, they were faced by white, far-right National Front protesters who opposed Muslim fundamentalists, but who did that with racist rhetoric. And there the women stood, Parliament Square, in between these two groups. What did they do? Rather than challenging only one side or simplifying their position, these women human rights defenders challenged both groups of men, even as they were threatened by both of them. They were encircled, but they were determined to create their own multidirectional space of resistance. And I have to say, this is very inspiring to me in thinking about the possibilities and ethical imperatives of engaging in simultaneous critique along multiple axes. Meanwhile, within the academic field of international law, feminist international law, today I wrote, it's very difficult to do that kind of multidirectional critique because we now have a certain kind of ideological gatekeeping, which I think is also happening in other parts of academia, and the growing predominance of what we are told are critical perspectives, especially in elite academic settings in the global north, limits whose voices can be heard and which concerns can be raised. And one feminist scholar from the Global South recently stressed to me the difficulty of even being published if one takes a different view. This is paradoxical because critical perspectives started off wanting to challenge academic disciplines for being insufficiently inclusive. So my essay tries to offer what I call a kind of counter-critical critique that should be understood as partly a friendly amendment because I share some of the underlying concerns that motivate some of what are called critical views. But some of the so-called critical literature in the West has been very problematic. Feminism is often cast as Western and white in ways that are meant to deconstruct power, but instead disappear the struggles of other women and women elsewhere, such as in Iran, and become a kind of backhanded assertion of power and patriarchal norms. As Pakistani women's rights advocates Farida and ISSH have written, the truth is that women have taken steps to assert their rights and have intervened to bring about a more just society in every era and in every location. That's why I talk about global feminisms, truly a global project, and women, life, freedom, and decades of Iranian struggle that Professor Tohidi has documented in her important work make this point crystal clear. In these polarizing times, Western theorists often overlook the growing critiques of some allegedly critical approaches by feminists in and descended from the global South. And you see some of them on the screen here. Writers and scholars from a variety of disciplines, like the Pakistani scholars Afia Zia and Sadia Abbas, the French-Algerian writer Fatiha Agag Boujahled, the Algerian sociologist Mariameh Ali-Lucas, the Egyptian-British political scientist Maryse Tadros, and the UK-based South Asian-led journal. These are all voices that are trying to put forward these kinds of complex, multi-directional critiques, and their work deserves wide consideration in academia. But instead, what we're seeing is one version of what is called a decolonial perspective is increasingly seen to cover the field. And one of the most articulate critiques of this comes from Dr. Mania, who I mentioned, who is Yemeni Egyptian Swiss, so like many of us has a very complex identity, and she wrote in this important book, Women and Sharia Law, The Impact of Legal Pluralism, that a paradigm of thinking that has become characteristic of Western academic post-colonial thought insists on treating people as homogenous groups, essentializing their cultures and religions, and underestimating the human rights consequences of their academic discourse. In these worldviews that she's describing, Iranian victims of human rights violations and the Iranian perpetrators of the abuses they suffered would simply be lumped together in a generic category of Muslim or from the global South, which is highly problematic. We're now seeing paradoxical developments, concepts like Orientalism and Islamophobia, which were originally developed to respond to certain kinds of past and present subordination, are now sometimes used by Western critical intellectuals to discipline those who exercise their equal right to be critical of their own contexts while deeply committed to those contexts. And I was again troubled to hear yesterday that this is happening now to those who seek to talk about women, life, freedom in academia. Sharifa Kedar, who, like me, is originally from Algeria, who's the president of the Algerian Observatory on Violence Against Women, reacts to these things very strongly from her position, given what she's experienced. She says, what is shocking is all the resistance to accepting freedom of expression related to the right of a Muslim woman to protect her physical and psychological well-being using the universal means available. And she notes that she speaks as a victim from Algeria from the 1990s who suffered violence at the hands of other Muslims, a victim who could not count on the support of Western intellectuals who were busy defending religious and cultural specificities. So you see there is a long history, alas, to this problem. So in my view, it's really misguided to suggest that because of the history of colonialism in places like Algeria, people in and descended from the global South must not today ask hard questions about their own societies, as everyone has the right to do everywhere. And I've asked again and again, why is it that only certain people are deemed to have the right to be critical of their own contexts? This brings me actually to a bit of family history. So the right to dissent is a basic human right, and I think this is something we need to remind our colleagues in academia of all the time. There is no global South exception. And I know this not just from theory, I know this from my own life experience, because during the 1990s, my Algerian father, who was in fact a veteran of the country's independence struggle, and then a professor at the University of Algiers, received repeated death threats from the fundamentalist armed groups that targeted the intelligentsia, all in the name of an extremist interpretation of religion and in an effort to take power. And this experience is part of why I feel an affinity for Iranians resisting fundamentalism today, and why I know what it feels like to have such an existential threat that one faces downplayed. In those difficult times in the 90s, my father turned for succor to the writing of 12th century philosopher Ibn Rushd, who described a synthesis of faith and reason, and at the same time to a play from the United States called Inherit the Wind, and you see some text on the screen. He watched this movie again and again in the 1990s. And Inherit the Wind is a depiction of the U.S. Scopes monkey trial, which was a prosecution in 1925 of a teacher for teaching evolution, which was against the law in the U.S. And this is a very timely reminder, given what's happening in the U.S., that this struggle against fundamentalism is global. And in the play, the defense lawyer representing the teacher manages to get the prosecution to admit that if God wishes a sponge, even a sponge under the sea, to think, the sponge thinks. And in response, the defense lawyer played in the movie there by Spencer Tracy says, then this man, he means the teacher, wishes to have the same privilege of a sponge. He wishes to think. And I think that's the line that was so meaningful to my father in those times. And what we see today is that dissident feminist voices from many regions and many countries, including Iran, are also demanding the so-called privilege of the sponge, the right to think and to think critically. But in some theoretical approaches, people in the global south have no internal politics of their own, becoming simply tropes in ideological battles elsewhere. And I think this overwriting of both the colonial past and the neo-colonial dynamics onto the very complex present in simplistic ways is disappearing the reality of contemporary challenges as we know them. So this brings me to my conclusion. So drawing all of this together, I assert that the task before scholars faced with complex human rights crises with particular gendered impacts, like the one in today's Iran, is to respond in a principled and thoughtful manner by building on diverse global feminist traditions and not apologizing for doing that, by listening to their advocates on the front lines, and by responding in a consistent manner that puts human rights above politics. All of us, scholars in the field of Iranian studies and academics generally around the world, have heavy responsibilities in the current polarized moment. I return to Roya Boramand, who I interviewed 10 years ago for a book that I wrote, and she said to me, if more people outside Iran criticized the fundamentalist regime and its violence, fewer people inside would have been killed. And this was a reminder to me that our analyses may lead to remedies being more or less likely to be available. Certainly it is people on the front lines in the driver's seat who should be in the lead, but there's a very big responsibility for those writing about these questions outside. What we theorize, someone else has to live. And I think that is where I will stop, and I will thank you so much for listening, and I wish you good luck with your important work.
There is already a Persian translation of Professor Bennoune's article, which covers part of. She only covered part of that article. So it's already translated and available thanks to the team of Iran Academia. So make sure to read it in Persian as well.
من سوالم به فارسی می‌پرسم.
Okay, sure.
من دو تا سوال دارم. یکی تو صحبتاشون گفتن که اینکه زنان ایرانی با زنان افغانستانی برای جندر آپارتاید علیه جندر آپارتاید همکاری داشته باشن میتونه، من اینطوری فهمیدم که میتونه پروبلماتیک باشه. اینو می‌خواستم یکم توضیح بدم. یکی هم این که رابطه اکتیویست، یعنی رابطه اکتیویستا با اکادمیکا، با کسانی که اینترنشنال لا دست دارن، این چطوری میتونه باشه؟ چطوری میتونن ارگانیک اینا با هم همکاری داشته باشن؟ مرسی.
Okay. The first question is, you said that Iranian and Afghan women can collaborate against gender apartheid. Would that be a problem because of that differences or controversy around it? Can still women, Afghan and Iranian women, collaborate with each other against apartheid?
That is a very important and complex question. So the global campaign on gender apartheid actually does bring together Iranian and Afghan women and many other allies, including from places in the Arab world, Latin America, and beyond. But there is some complexity because, of course, the two country situations are very different. And in Afghanistan, you have sort of a total gender apartheid. You have a total segregation. You have a complete banning of women from things like employment and education and so on. So it's a very extreme example. So very often when we try to get governments to recognize gender apartheid, that may be the example that we cite. Also because for now, the Taliban, thankfully, are not at the table in the UN. If you talk about Iran, it becomes more complicated because, of course, Iran is at the table and they have good friends like the government of South Africa that will seek to protect them. So what we've had to do is be very strategic, but also trying to be principled because there are not all, but many important Iranian women prisoners who are saying what they are fighting is gender apartheid, and I think we also have to respect that point of view. So I think there can be alliances, but we have to be very careful and strategic and nuanced as well as principled.
Right. Very well. And her second question was that how do you see the basis of collaboration between the lawyers, international lawyers, activists, and academics?
That's a great question. For me, one of the reasons that I have so enjoyed this conference is because I really think it's important to work in an interdisciplinary way. As I always tell my students, human rights law is just one small piece of human rights, which is a much bigger discipline. And so I think we have to get out of our silos. I don't know how to translate. There must be a better way of saying that. And work together across disciplines. I think lawyers can be very helpful in explaining the legal tools that are available, but they also need to be humble and remember that there are many other tools like communication, like the arts. I always say the song Baraya, which you saw in the PowerPoint, actually was much more powerful than the UN human rights reports in spreading the word internationally.
Very beautifully said. Okay. Yes, you.
Thank you very much. I find your talk to be very inspiring, and I feel like it intervenes into, for example, post-colonial discourses in a very poignant way. As someone who is both active in pro-Palestinian movements, the Iranian diasporic movement, and researches on these topics, I wanted to ask, and in the conclusion you kind of perhaps already answered this question, but perhaps you could expand on this. Where do you see the role of researchers and theoreticians, social theorists, social philosophers, within these struggles for liberation, for emancipation? Do you think that the role should be to primarily engage in knowledge production and knowledge sharing? Or, and for example, within the social sciences, there are approaches such as participatory action research, which really embeds social research into the struggle of emancipatory movements. Where do you see that distinction, and where do you perhaps also draw the line of an engaged way of theorizing, which in a way, I would say, does not distance itself from struggle, but rather tries to lend itself as a tool for struggle?
I'm somewhat dogmatic in my own field. I always say that you really shouldn't theorize about human rights if you haven't actually practiced human rights, because a lot of theory doesn't really work. And I often think of what Catherine McKinnon, the feminist legal theorist, said once. She said, when people say something is a good idea in theory but not in practice, it's really not very good theory. And I think finding thoughtful ways of bringing together theory and practice is critically important. At the same time, I think academics may have very distinct roles. I think knowledge production is critically important. It is a form of human rights struggle of its own. And I think part of my answer is very generational. and you've read the long bio that sort of explains why I feel this way now. I think a big part of the job of my generation is to pass the baton, to try to teach the younger generation about some of the human rights struggles of the past, the ways in which we fought to build, in my discipline, a feminist international law, the ways we failed and the ways we succeeded, so that they can build on what was good, throw out what didn't work, and take the work forward. And I think you described a very full toolkit, and it is for each person, I think, to choose from that toolkit the best ways of doing that.